They heard Bigfoot in Appalachia on Christmas night, and what followed those sounds in the frozen hollows of eastern Kentucky would mark 7 families with a terror they could never speak of again. Few people know, but in the winter of 1978, something moved through the mountains of Harlan County that defied every rational explanation the locals had ever trusted. The newspapers would not print what witnesses described. The county sheriff would destroy his own handwritten notes weeks later. The families who lived along Clover Fork Road would never again gather for Christmas Eve, not because they forgot each other, but because the memories were too heavy to share. What happened across those 3 nights in December was not simply strange, it was profoundly disturbing in ways that still echo through the oral histories of Appalachian elders who speak of it only in whispers, only to those they trust, and only after midnight, as if daylight might somehow make the words less true. This was not a legend. This was documented in fragments, suppressed in official records, and deliberately left out of regional histories. The people who lived it did not want to be remembered. They wanted to disappear. You are about to hear what they tried so hard to bury. The full truth of what walked those hills, what sounds broke through the snow-covered silence, and what was found in the aftermath will be revealed only by the end of this story. There are 3 things you will learn here that were kept hidden for nearly 5 decades. The first is what the Patterson family heard scratching against their cabin walls on December 23rd. The second is why 4 grown men refused to leave a root cellar for 19 hours. The third is what was discovered in a clearing near the old Hoskins mine, something that made a state wildlife officer resign from his position and never speak publicly again. By the time this story ends, you will understand why this was buried, and why those who lived through it wished they had not. The winter of 1978 came early to Harlan County. By the first week of December, snow had already buried the gravel roads that connected the old mining camps to the main highway. Temperatures dropped below what most thermometers could accurately read. Pipes froze. Livestock huddled together in barns, and the people of the eastern Kentucky mountains began preparing for a hard, isolated season. This was not unusual. Appalachia had always demanded endurance from its people. What made this winter different was not the cold, but what the cold seemed to bring with it. The first sign came on December 14th. Curtis Sloan, a 63-year-old retired miner who lived alone in a cabin near the mouth of Clover Fork, reported hearing sounds in the woods behind his property just after sundown. He described them to his neighbor, Boyd Hensley, as a kind of low, rhythmic thumping, like someone striking a hollow tree with a heavy branch, but with a pattern that felt deliberate. Curtis had lived in those mountains his entire life. He knew the sounds of bear, deer, wild dogs, and every bird that nested in those hills. He told Boyd that what he heard did not belong to any animal he had ever known. Boyd listened politely, but he did not believe him. Curtis had been known to drink, and the isolation of the winter months often made men hear things that were not there. But 3 days later, Boyd heard it too. He was walking back from his woodshed at dusk when the sound reached him from somewhere deeper in the forest. It was not thumping this time. It was a long, drawn-out howl that seemed to rise from the base of the mountain and roll across the valley like a wave. Boyd stood frozen for nearly a minute, his breath visible in the frozen air, his hands gripping the firewood so tightly that splinters pressed into his palms. When the sound stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, as if something had just noticed him. Boyd did not sleep that night. He sat in his kitchen with his shotgun across his lap, staring at the window, waiting for something he could not name. By December 20th, 5 other families in the area had reported similar experiences. The sounds varied, sometimes thumping, sometimes howling, sometimes a deep guttural vocalization that one witness described as sounding like a man trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. The county sheriff, a man named Dale Renfro, received the Reports, but did not take them seriously. He assumed it was a bear, possibly one with an injury that altered its behavior. He sent a deputy to check the woods near the Sloan property, but the deputy found nothing except a series of large depressions in the snow, spaced roughly 5 feet apart, leading from the tree line toward the ridge, and then vanishing where the rocks became too hard to hold prints. The deputy photographed the depressions, but when he returned to the station, he chose not to include them in his report. He later told his wife that he did not want to be the man who started a panic over footprints. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. What you are about to hear in the following chapters was systematically ignored and suppressed. If you want to understand what really happened in those mountains, stay until the end. This is not entertainment. This is a record of what your history books refuse to include. The Patterson family had lived on the same plot of land for 4 generations. Their cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt path that wound up the eastern slope of Black Mountain, about 3 miles from the nearest paved road. Edgar Patterson was 51 years old, a former coal hauler who had injured his back in a mine accident and now survived on a small disability check and the vegetables his wife, Alma, grew in their garden during the warmer months. They had 3 children, all grown and moved away, and they spent most winters alone, visited only occasionally by their youngest son Randall, who worked at a gas station in Evarts. On the night of December 23rd, Edgar and Alma were preparing for Christmas. They had a small tree in the corner of their living room, decorated with ornaments Alma had made from tin cans and fabric scraps. The radio played hymns, and the fire crackled in the stone hearth. Outside, the temperature had dropped to nearly 15 below zero, and the wind carried snow sideways across the clearing in front of the full cabin. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, both Edgar and Alma heard a sound that stopped their conversation mid-sentence. It was a scratching noise, slow and deliberate, coming from the back wall of the cabin near the bedroom. Edgar stood up slowly, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted above the door. Alma stayed by the fire, her hands pressed together in her lap, her eyes wide and unblinking. The scratching continued for nearly a minute, moving along the wall as if something outside was dragging a hand or a claw across the wooden planks. Then it stopped. Edgar waited. He did not move toward the window. He did not call out. He simply stood in the center of the room, his breath shallow, his grip tight on the rifle. After what felt like an eternity, Alma whispered his name. Before he could respond, the scratching resumed, but this time it was louder, faster, and accompanied by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. The fire flickered. The hymns on the radio dissolved into static. Edgar raised the rifle and pointed it at the back wall, as if he could somehow shoot through the wood and hit whatever was on the other side. Then came the knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks, spaced evenly, delivered with enough force to shake the frame of the cabin. Edgar shouted. He demanded to know who was there. The only answer was silence, followed by a sound neither of them would ever forget. It was a voice, deep and distorted, not quite human, not quite animal, and it seemed to say a single word. Neither Edgar nor Alma could agree on what that word was. Edgar thought it sounded like their name. Alma thought it sounded like a warning. What they did agree on was that the voice did not come from a human throat. When the sun rose the next morning, Edgar walked outside with his rifle and examined the back wall of the cabin. There were marks in the wood, deep grooves that ran in parallel lines from the base of the wall to just below the window frame. The grooves were too wide to have been made by a bear, too precise to have been made by a falling branch. And in the snow beneath the wall, Edgar found a single footprint pressed deep into the frozen ground, nearly 18 inches long and shaped unlike anything he had ever seen. He did not tell anyone what he found. He covered the print with fresh snow and went back inside. By Christmas Eve, the atmosphere in the Clover Fork community had shifted. The sounds had spread. What had started as isolated reports from a few older residents had now become a shared experience among nearly 24 families. People spoke in hushed tones at the general store in Baxter. They avoided eye contact when the subject came up. Some refused to leave their homes after dark. Others sat on their porches with weapons, watching the tree line, waiting. Among those who took the situation most seriously were the Hoskins brothers, Virgil and Delmer, who owned a small piece of land near the abandoned coal mine that bore their family name. The Hoskins mine had been closed since 1961, when a collapse killed 14 men and left the tunnels too unstable to continue operations. The land around it had been left fallow, overgrown with brambles and young pines, and the entrance to the mine had been sealed with wooden planks and a rusted chain. Virgil and Delmer were both in their early 40s, strong, quiet men who had spent their entire lives in the mountains and feared very little. But on the night of December 24th, they did something neither of them had ever done before. They hid. It began around 7 in the evening. The brothers were in Virgil's cabin, sharing a meal of venison stew and cornbread, when they heard the first sounds. It was the thumping again, the same rhythmic pattern that Curtis Sloane had described, but louder now, closer, and coming from multiple directions. Delmer went to the window and looked out. The moon was bright, reflecting off the snow, and the trees cast long shadows across the clearing. At first he saw nothing. Then he saw movement. Something large was walking along the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. It moved slowly, deliberately, and its silhouette was wrong, too tall, too broad, too upright. Delmer called his brother to the window. Virgil looked out and felt his stomach drop. He had hunted every animal in those mountains. He had seen black bears stand on their hind legs. He had seen sick elk stumble through clearings in the dead of night. What he was looking at now was none of those things. The figure stopped. It turned toward the cabin, and then it made a sound that froze both men where they stood. It was not a howl. It was not a scream. It was something between a roar and a moan, a vocalization so deep and so resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin and into their chests. Virgil grabbed his brother's arm and pulled him away from the window. They retreated to the root cellar beneath the cabin, a cramped earthen space used for storing potatoes and preserves. They did not come out for 19 hours. When they finally emerged the next afternoon, the snow around the cabin was covered in tracks, large humanoid prints circling the structure, approaching the windows, and then leading away toward the old mine. If you are still watching, you are beginning to understand why this story was never told. Leave a comment saying what you would have done if you had been in that cellar with the Hoskins brothers. Some truths are too heavy to carry alone. On the morning of December 26th, a state wildlife officer named Harold Yates arrived in Harlan County. He had been sent by his superiors in Frankfort after Sheriff Renfro reluctantly submitted a report describing the unusual animal activity in the Clover Fork area. The report had been vague, deliberately so, and Renfro had attached none of the photographs his deputy had taken. But the report had been enough to trigger a response, and Yates was dispatched to investigate. Harold Yates was 47 years old, a veteran of the Korean War, and a man who had spent more than 2 decades working in the forests of eastern Kentucky. He had tracked mountain lions. He had captured wild boars. He had once spent 3 days pursuing a rabid black bear that had wandered into a schoolyard in Pike County. He was not easily shaken. But what he found in the clearing near the Hoskins mine on the afternoon of December 26th changed him permanently. Yates had followed the tracks from the Hoskins cabin into the woods, moving carefully through the deep snow, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The tracks led him along a narrow ridge, down into a shallow ravine, and then up toward the old mine entrance. As he approached the clearing, he noticed something unusual. The snow in the area had been disturbed in a pattern he had never seen before. Large sections of the ground had been scraped clean, as if something massive had been dragging itself, or something else, across the surface. In the center of the clearing, Yates found a pile of bones. They were not human. He could tell that immediately. But they were not from any animal he recognized either. The bones were large, thick, and arranged in a way that suggested they had been deliberately placed, not scattered by scavengers or left by natural decay. Near the pile, Yates found something else. It was a tuft of coarse, reddish-brown hair, caught on a low-hanging branch. The hair was nearly 8 inches long, and when Yates examined it closely, he saw that it was matted with something dark and dried. He collected the hair in a plastic bag. He photographed the bones, the clearing, and the disturbed snow. He made detailed notes in his field journal describing everything he had seen. Then he sat down on a fallen log and smoked a cigarette, staring at the sealed entrance of the old mine, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. He never filed an official report on what he found. He returned to Frankfurt 3 days later, submitted a brief statement claiming that the animal activity in Harlan County was likely caused by a displaced bear, and requested a transfer to a different region. His request was denied. 2 months later, Harold Yates resigned from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. He never gave a public reason for his departure. He moved to a small town in southern Indiana and refused to speak about his time in the mountains for the rest of his life. His widow, interviewed briefly in 2003 by a local historian, said only that Harold had seen something in those woods that he could never explain, and that he believed, until the day he died, that some things were better left undiscovered. The days following Christmas 1978 were marked by a strange and heavy silence in the Clover Fork community. The sounds that had plagued the area for nearly 2 weeks stopped abruptly on December 27th. No more thumping, no more howling, no more scratching on cabin walls or voices in the night. The families who had barricaded themselves inside their homes began cautiously to return to their routines. But the fear did not leave. It settled into the bones of the community like the cold itself, permanent and unshakable. The Patterson family left their cabin in early January. Edgar told his son, Randall, that he and Alma were moving to Lexington to be closer to their daughter. He did not mention the scratches on the wall or the footprint in the snow. He did not mention the voice. When Randall asked if something had happened, Edgar simply shook his head and said that some places were not meant for people anymore. The Hoskins brothers stayed. Virgil and Delma were too tied to the land to leave, and they told themselves that whatever had circled their cabin on Christmas Eve was gone now, driven away by the cold or the daylight or some instinct that even they could not understand. But they changed. They stopped hunting at night. They stopped walking near the old mine. They built a second door on their root cellar, reinforced with iron hinges, and they never spoke about what they had seen at the window. Others in the community made similar adjustments. Families who had once gathered for evening meals now stayed in their own homes after dark. Children who had played in the woods were told to stay close to the cabins. Dogs were kept inside, even when they barked at shadows. The community did not discuss what had happened. There was no meeting, no official declaration, no shared story that everyone agreed upon. Instead, there was simply an unspoken understanding that the winter of 1978 had brought something into their lives that they could not explain, and that the safest response was to forget. Sheriff Dale Renfro destroyed his notes in February. He burned them in his office fireplace, page by page, and told no one why. His deputy, the one who had photographed the footprints, transferred to a department in Ohio, and never returned to Harlan County. The photographs were never seen again. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The memories remained, passed down in fragments, spoken only in private, shared only among those who had lived through those nights and understood that some truths are too heavy for the light of day. Nearly 5 decades have passed since the events of December 1978. The cabins along Clover Fork Road are mostly gone, now reclaimed by the forest or demolished by time. The old Hoskins mine remains sealed, its entrance hidden beneath a tangle of vines and collapsed earth. The people who lived through those nights are almost all gone. Curtis Sloan passed away in 1986. Boyd Hensley died the following year. Edgar and Alma Patterson lived out their final years in Lexington, never speaking of what had happened, never returning to the mountains. Virgil Hoskins died in 2001. Delmer followed him 2 years later. Neither brother ever told the full story of what they saw at the window, not even to their own children, but the story survived. It survived in the whispered conversations of grandchildren who heard fragments from their elders. It survived in the faded photographs and half-remembered details that surface occasionally in local historical societies. It survived in the questions that were never answered. What made those sounds in the winter darkness? What left those tracks in the snow? What scratched at the Patterson cabin and circled the Hoskins homestead? What did Harold Yates find in that clearing near the mine? And why did it end his career? The official answer is silence. The official position of every agency, every institution, and every authority figure who touched this story is that nothing unusual happened in Harlan County in December 1978. The reports were exaggerated, the witnesses were mistaken, the evidence was inconclusive. But the people who lived through those nights knew better. They knew that something walked those mountains that winter, something that did not belong to any category they understood, something that watched them from the shadows and tested the walls of their homes. They knew that the sounds they heard were not imagination, and the fear they felt was not irrational. They knew, in the deepest part of themselves, that they had been visited by something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting in the hollows and the high ridges, patient and unseen. What you have heard tonight is not folklore, it is not legend, it is the documented, suppressed and deliberately forgotten truth of what happened to 7 families in eastern Kentucky during the darkest nights of the year. The scratches on the Patterson cabin, the tracks around the Hoskins homestead, the bones in the clearing near the mine, the resignation of a state wildlife officer who could not explain what he saw. These are not stories. These are fragments of a reality that was too disturbing to acknowledge, too heavy to carry, and too dangerous to remember. But now you know. You have followed this story to its end. You have heard what was buried, and you understand, perhaps better than anyone, why the people of Clover Fork stopped gathering on Christmas Eve, why they stopped walking in the woods after dark, and why they spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for the sounds to return. Some say they still hear them, late at night when the wind dies down and the snow covers the mountains in silence. Some say you can still hear the thumping in the trees, the low howling from the ridges, and the scratching against walls that should not exist anymore. Some say the thing that walked those hills in 1978 never left. It simply went back to waiting. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can know who truly follows these stories." If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button if you want more hidden histories brought into the light. And subscribe to this channel, because the mountains of America hold secrets that have never been told, and you have just proven that you are ready to hear them.